Welcome to the Pragmatic Hero's Journey, a monthly podcast about becoming a pragmatic author. Hosted by Tammy Corin and Tim Mitra. On this episode, we talk to Ken Kousen about his journey to becoming a pragmatic author. This episode was recorded on July 15, 2021. The Pragmatic Hero's Journey podcast is owned and operated by the Pragmatic Programmers, LLC, home of the Pragmatic Bookshelf. The Pragmatic Programmers, founded by Andy Hunt and Dave Thomas, has one simple goal: to improve the lives of professional developers.
So, Ken,
yes,
we like to have our guests tell the audience who they are and what they do. Can you do that for us?
Okay, well, my name's Ken Kousen. The last name's pronounced cousin like the relative, even though it doesn't look like it. My day job primarily is I teach software development training classes. Most of the classes I teach are in areas somewhat related to Java. So that includes Spring Framework, that includes alternative JVM languages like Groovy or Kotlin, that includes Android, also things like Gradle as a build tool or JUnit and various testing mechanisms, things like that. I've been a one-person company for about 15 years now. So I'm an independent, but I work with many partner relations. I also am a speaker on the No Fluff, Just Stuff conference tour, as are many pragmatic authors, as it turns out. And I've given talks at various places around the world, so I've been doing that for quite some time. And of course, occasionally I write books as well.
So I want to ask, though, what did you do before you were a single person? Were you always a computer science-y kind of developer person?
I was a career changer like so many people in IT. I actually started off as a research scientist. So I have way too many academic degrees that I don't use. And I spent about 10 years doing research in, well, let's say, unsteady aerodynamics in jet engines, which basically meant lots of math and lots of Fortran, believe it or not. The nightmares have ended, but it took a while. And then I moved, I went back to school at night and learned computer science. So I had shifted in I guess this was the early 90s or mid 90s, I guess, to an AI group back before AI was cool, like now. So there was some stuff with neural nets, some stuff with genetic algorithms. And it only took me a couple months to realize that 15 years of coding in Fortran hadn't taught me anything about software development. So I went back to school at night at a local Rensselaer at Hartford, in Hartford, Connecticut. I'm based in that area, and got my CS degree. And once I got that, it was time to leave, because what I realized along the way that I really wanted to do is I wanted to teach. I originally had intended to be a professor. That was always the plan. And then a couple of things intervened with that. Like, first of all, the whole academic market collapsed, if you're familiar with that at all. There's very few openings. And also, I found out the job of a professor wasn't really what I thought it was. It wasn't anything like what I'd been hoping for. And I can actually, if you're interested, I can actually tell you the epiphany that happened, the actual event. Well, at some point, I'm going to put this in my newsletter. I just haven't gotten around to it yet. But basically, I had transferred to this IT group, and I'd gone back to school at night to get the CS degree. It was a master's in computer science, and I was getting near the end of it. But one morning, I was sitting in a networking class and not really paying attention, which I still kind of regret, but nevertheless. And I was annoyed because it turned out that a couple other members of my team were going to attend a Java training class. And I was annoyed because, first of all, I already was certified in Java. That's how I was going to go get a job in the new area. I had taken the certification exam. This was back in early 2000, actually, like spring of 2000. So the e-commerce bubble had burst, but we didn't know it yet. So I was annoyed because they were going to go to this training class. And I was like, why are they doing that when I already have the certification? I want to do this work and everything. And then a light bulb went off and I went, hey, I wonder who teaches those things anyway. And that was the first time, because I didn't even know there were such things when I was coming up through the ranks. And so I went back to my company that Monday and I said, who do we hire to teach these training classes? How do we find that? And they put me in touch with training companies. And I contacted them and said, are you interested in trainers? And that's where it all started. So what I eventually did is I joined a tiny, like 10-person training company. And I was there for about 5 years teaching training classes, primarily in Java, things like that, XML back in those days. And then I moved out on my own in about 2005, and I've been an independent ever since.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I did the same thing in the iOS community when, I joined it as a switcher as well. And, there was nobody teaching iOS. And so I put my hand up at one point and said, hey, I could do that. And that's how I kind of sort of learned more than I knew at the time, right? But yeah, I want to go back to something you said earlier, and sure. It's curious because for IT people, because I'm a career switcher, and you said you are too. But why do you think it is that IT people or people who do the sort of stuff that we do are career switchers? Well,
I used to do a survey in each training class to say how many people started off in some area connected to IT and have stayed there the whole time. And the numbers were actually pretty stable for a long time, that you get about, 40% of people came from outside the community, And for me, again, it was working in an area that suddenly made me realize I needed training. But I had been working with software previously. Now, I don't know why so many people changed careers. Back in the 2000s and then later again, it was partly because it was a lucrative area. There were jobs in that area, and they were well-paying jobs, and they were looking for it. It's also an area that is reasonably open and welcoming, if you will, to non-practitioners, to people who are new to it. There are mechanisms available for them. By the way, I always used to ask, what people came from. And the most unusual answer I got one year was I had a race car driver in class one year, former race car driver, and he always made it to class on time. So I don't really know, because the answers are all over the map, but it's an area that seems to be reasonably accessible, and still it tends to attract people who have some interest in math science type areas, and they're able to adapt to it pretty quickly.
Yeah, sort of an engineering. I mean, I'm a creative person by desire and want and need and stuff, and so I come at it from an artist point of view. But yeah, I think there's a lot of creative energies in engineering type practices, right? But I also want to touch on another thing that you said. You did the full computer science thing. Like I think you said you were working on a master's as well.
Yeah, I got the master's.
So,
yes, right.
So here's the question. I mean, again, I talk to a lot of our audience too are wannabe developers as well, and wannabe authors, hopefully. But the question that comes up a lot is, do you think you need a computer science degree to do the kind of development that we do on Android and iOS?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, no way. In fact, as a matter of fact, first of all, I don't even talk most of the time about my academic background, because here I've got all these degrees, and I've entered an area where degrees are looked upon with some suspicion, actually, rather than looked as something valuable. In fact, I think everybody in IT knows at least one developer who is phenomenal, who has almost nothing in the way of academic credentials. They have on-the-job training, or they've learned as they've gone, or whatever. So, no, I think it helps because it gives you a survey, and it lets you know what's done, what's around, and it gives you some ins, if you will. But no, the only thing the academic degrees are required for in computer science is getting past the HR department, so you can get to the people you need to get to get a real job.
That explains my problem. But yeah, and coming back, well, that and a bunch of other things too. But
well, just to throw another point at that, the thing is that in engineering, when I was in engineering, the field has been around for hundreds of years. And the people who are on the forefront of doing innovative things were in academia, a lot of them. The people in the working professional community were mostly using things that have been known for centuries, if you will. It just wasn't that different, although you could get things like material science and stuff. But in computer science, the vast majority of innovation seems to me to come from the field, people actually doing the work. And it takes a long time for innovations to make their way back into academia. Now, there are exceptions, of course. There's some really good work being done by people and professors on things like concurrency and stuff. But in general, you're hoping that when you're talking to someone who's coming right out of school, that they even have a basic idea of how people really write software today. And that's not necessarily true.
I think we can agree that the interview process for technical interviews is broken, right? So, I mean, why do you think that there's, I mean, other than the fact that how do you measure somebody, you have to have something to measure by, but why do you think we spend so much time on these, algorithm, kind of questions that really, I mean, I've never really needed them in my career, Well, it's that knowledge.
This actually comes up partly in my book, and not that directly, but how do you know somebody is good at their job? That's really the question you're trying to find out. And when you're hiring, you're trying to figure out if somebody's good at it. And if you just go by resumes, I mean, if you've ever had to evaluate a stack of resumes, the evaluation works kind of the same way every time. It's that there's a couple at the top where you go, if we can get them, we want them, no question. We probably can't afford them. And then there's a handful at the bottom where you go, yeah, they're just not qualified. That's not going to work. And then there's this huge mass in the middle where everybody looks good because it's so important to look good on paper. I mean, in fact, it's so important to look good on paper, you can hire companies to help you look good on paper, and yet you don't really know if they're any good or not. So we try to figure out whether they know what they're talking about. And sometimes there's evidence like a public GitHub repository or something, but the absence of that doesn't tell you anything because maybe they were in a company where there was no freedom to do that, or that they didn't have time to do that, or if they're a woman or underrepresented minority and they just didn't want to make a public presence like that attracts the sorts of people that can attract, then that's completely understandable too. So we're kind of stuck trying to figure out how good somebody is. And then, of course, the segue that into the thing about the book is that how much more difficult that is when you're talking about the sort of low-level managers that we deal with on a regular basis. I mean, how do you know if they're any good or not? I mean, in my company, when I spent like 12 years in a Fortune 50 company, a huge company, and if you merely went by the end-of-year project reports, there was never a failed project in that company ever. And of course, that's ridiculous. Projects failed all the time. But there's always a way to paint it, right? We learned this, we acquired that, we figured out what, this technical debt, and we fixed this problem. And, if you can't make it look good on paper, then you can't do the job. So it's a problem. It's a serious problem.
How do you take all of that information and figure out who to hire? Like, I didn't want this conversation to turn into an interviewee type thing, but like, that's really what it's about. I mean, we're all looking for jobs at one time or another. How do you land that job? And as a manager, how do you find out who's capable of doing that job?
Well, I'll simply say that I don't have an answer to that question. I don't really, because it's a really hard question.
Big question.
And there are a lot of people who do address questions like that. There's a lot of research out there. I would go talk to Johanna Rothman, for example, and see what she does, that sort of thing. I'll simply say that one problem that you're trying to avoid is winding up with only the people who seem to pattern match the sort of people already there. That you wind up restricting your assessment to people who look like you and sound like you and have the same values and the same background as you. And that can be the source of all kinds of problems. It avoids getting into issues of, differences of opinion and diversity and things like that. And therefore, it's very important to look outside your comfort zone for applicants, for people who are not like the people on the team. And don't fall back on lazy abstractions like, oh, that's a bad culture fit, to rule out people who could potentially be extremely valuable contributors. And you just don't do it because you don't have a metric for it. So that's the only thing I worry about. I don't, since I'm a one-person company, I don't really hire anybody, and I have to talk to employers a lot, but I don't directly work in that field.
So how do you find work in that way? I mean, like, is it like word of mouth or?
Well, it's funny because for a long time, when I first got involved in the training business, it turns out it's not a huge community. I didn't realize that. It's actually pretty small. So once I contacted like 3 or 4 training companies, then one company would say, well, we don't have anything, but we'll refer you to another. And from then on, most of the work was, in fact, word of mouth. And then what I did is I would try to increase my, what we would now call social media presence. And I try to, speak at conferences and have a blog. And that's how I started out with that. And just do all the things we know now tend to raise your visibility. And then when somebody would need a trainer in a particular area, they would look at all the people, the names they knew, and I'd be one of the few people whose job it was to teach those classes. Because there'd be lots of people who would be developers in that area or workers in that area, but not that many who teach. And therefore, most of my work came from word of mouth that way.
Right. Cool.
Now, of course, then later I formed some partnership relations like with the O'Reilly Media, for example. And when I started writing books over there, that gave me access to teach classes on the O'Reilly Learning Platform. And also, of course, I eventually wound up on the No Fluff, Just Stuff conference tour. And that's another way to make a lot of contacts, meet a lot of people, and therefore do some marketing in that fashion as well. And all this was much easier when I became an independent. Although I'll also say the downside to that, if it is a downside, is that my job is never really clear beyond, say, a 2 to 3 month time frame. I'm never really sure what I'm going to be doing more than 2 or 3 months in advance. But I actually like it. As they say, the worst class in the world ends in a week, so you'll be all right.
Right.
So let's talk about that. What made you decide to want to write books?
I'd always kind of wanted to do that. When I was the thing is, I say I was a career changer, and I was a career changer because I was truly miserable. And I was miserable in a somewhat unusual way in that I have all these degrees from some of the top universities in the world, and I was virtually a failure. It played to all my weaknesses, that job. I mean, there were very few opportunities to do the things I like to do, like, written and oral communications didn't come up that often, and making presentations, which I like to do, didn't happen more than a couple times a year. And it wasn't a very social activity. I couldn't see people that often, and I really enjoyed teaching. So as I say, it was always a plan to be a professor, and that looked like it was never going to happen. So it was just going to be a disaster. I was a couple steps away from completely failing. So I was always looking for an alternative. And back in the early 90s, believe it or not, I thought, I'd kind of like to write science fiction, believe it or not, and that was before I realized that there are more full-time employed actors than there are full-time employed writers. Which one of the things I learned about it. But in like a year and a half, I produced, 25 short stories, about 2/3 of a novel, collected about 110 rejection slips, and realized that I enjoyed having written a lot more than I enjoyed writing. So it wasn't going to be the way out, but I'd always had an interest in writing. So when I wound up later as a trainer and then I was going to places like the No Fluff, Just Stuff conference tour, that's when I went to talks by people like, for example, Dave Thomas or Scott Davis, and they'd talk about the books they'd written. And I thought, I'd like to get involved. And that's kind of where it started. I wound up being a tech editor, in fact, for the Prags, believe it or not, back in 2008, I think, for Scott Davis's Groovy Recipes book, for example. And that went well enough. Then I was a tech editor for Venkat Subramaniam's Groovy book as well. So they said, well, do you want to propose a book of your own? And I proposed 2 different books back in the 2008 timeframe, both of which were rejected. And it's only 10 years later that I finally got a chance to write for the Prags.
So let's talk about that for a minute.
Sure.
Like, as an author, not everything you write is 100% on point, or you send out these queries and you get rejections. How do you keep going as an author to say, no, I really have a voice. I want someone to hear me. How do you rally around yourself and just keep doing it? Like, is there some sort of advice you can give to new authors that says, look, just keep doing it? Or how did you get going from rejected to, I mean, you've got more than one book now. I mean, you're out there.
Yeah, this current book that eventually we'll talk about, the Help Your Boss Help You book, that's book number 5 for me. And basically, the reason my books were rejected was, my proposals, I should say, was never because they weren't interested in me or anything like that. It was more that the market wasn't going to support the topics that I was proposing. And at least that was the argument at the time. And I could understand that. It was reasonable. I didn't necessarily agree with it, but I wasn't upset either. But then the editors that I was talking to at the Prag said, well, you might want to talk to Manning, or you might want to talk to O'Reilly, or you might want to talk to another publisher. And in fact, that referral got me to Manning, and Manning also rejected my book. But then one of their authors was having trouble completing a book, and they said, you want to be a co-author with that person? And that's where it all started. Ultimately, even though what happened eventually is that co-author backed out, and I wound up with my first book, which was the Making Java Groovy book over at Manning. So it started with getting involved as a tech editor and writing a blog, which was my way of learning things in a public fashion, getting advice from others. And that led to opportunities. And I was just very open to saying, okay, sooner or later, there'll be a chance on some topic I'm interested in writing about. And when it comes up, I'm just going to go for it. That's where it all started.
And what about this most current book with us, the Managing Your Manager?
Yeah, well, what happened?
I got the title wrong on that, didn't I?
You did, yeah.
In my opinion.
I did.
Well, in my opinion.
Hang on, Ken. Let me do that again.
Just learned the title 2 minutes ago and you got it wrong.
I know. Through the power of editing.
Help your boss help you. Help your co-host help you.
Right. But Ken, if you can,
sure,
tell us how the current book plays into where you're at now.
Okay, so what happened is I joined the No Fluff Just Stuff conference tour about 10 years ago. So for those who are not aware, that's a tour that gives conferences on the weekends in about a dozen cities around the U.S.
I think you need to explain what No Fluff is, too.
Yeah, exactly. The concept there is that there's no marketing people, there's no sales individuals. It's all technical talks on topics of interest. They're all an hour and a half apart. And you could spend like half a day Friday, then all day Saturday and Sunday. And, they're in so many cities around the country that you could go to a local conference. So the costs are down and everything. And the no fluff part simply means that there's nothing other than technical talks involved. Right. So my in, if you will, on the tour was that I was working on that Groovy book, the Making Java Groovy. And Groovy at the time was reasonably hot. And unfortunately,
Groovy's a thing. Oh, I'm sorry. So I was going to say I'm a bit jaded as an iOS developer because I was going to say, how do you make Java Groovy? But Groovy's an actual thing?
Groovy's a programming language that runs on the JVM. It's an alternative JVM language, and it's, frankly, wonderful. I mean, it's still kind of my first love, to be honest with you, because you can do everything in Java that you would do before. And the syntax in Groovy is close enough to Java that it's very easy. The learning curve is very low for existing Java developers. And it just makes your Java better, if you will. But and in fact, the Gradle build tool emerged out of that ecosystem. So did the Spock testing framework. And the other framework that was hot at the time was Grails. Grails was Rails-like, but based on Spring and Hibernate. Okay. So at any rate, that was my in, if you will. And the thing is, though, is that if you're going to be a regular speaker on the tour, you have to have a wide range of things you talk about, because these are conferences where they use pretty much the same group of people at every conference. And you have to give, maybe 8-10 talks in a weekend, and therefore you have to have a range of topics to discuss. And coming up with new topics every year is always a challenge. Well, I was looking for a topic that was, I guess you'd call it soft skills, something that wasn't going to expire, something that wasn't going to I have to revise every year to make it up to date and everything. And I realized, and this is something I've been thinking about for years, is that the entire management literature pretty much is written for managers. It's not written for technical professionals who are not on the managerial track, but still have to deal with managers on a regular basis. So the beginnings of my talk, I always called it Managing Your Manager. How do you build a relationship with your boss that allows you to get what you want without being in the management hierarchy, and still gives the manager what they need so that you become a valuable employee to them, that you're somebody they want to keep around and make happy. And these are just ideas that I've been mulling around for, 30 years of my career, because I've made pretty much every mistake you can make on that. So it started off as a talk on the tour. And And I gave it and for like 4 or 5 years, and it was very well received. And I was always threatening to turn it into a book, but I had never gotten around to doing it. Well, then I was, by the time the thing started to happen, I was writing books for O'Reilly. Like I did the Modern Java Recipes book and my Kotlin cookbook over there. And my editor at the time was Susan Conant, who you may know. Susan was,
I know.
Yeah, Susan was briefly a managing.
I said, she's amazing, by the way.
Yeah, she was great. And she eventually wound up a managing editor at the Prags for a while before she moved on to Apple. And she was interested when I told her about this, and we therefore turned it into a training class on the O'Reilly Learning Platform and then into a video as well over there. And when it came time to write a book about it, the O'Reilly people were reluctant, partly because it was going to be a short book. I mean, it wasn't going to be this big thing. And when Susan moved over to the Prags, she asked me, she said, do you want to do it here? And I said, well, I've always wanted to write for the Prags because I always had. You know, I heard so many good things. And of course, Venkat Subramaniam's a good friend and he loves it at the Prags, you know. So I'd always wanted to work there. So because Susan was there, I wrote the proposal. And the title of the book was Managing Your Manager. And when it was accepted, that's the title we worked with all the way until, less than 6 months ago. At which point the powers that be did their searches and their search engine optimization stuff and said, you can't use that title. I mean, maybe I'm not as creative as I thought, and other people had used that title or that just didn't come up much. And they said, no, we need a different title. And I'm like, oh, great. So I contacted the person who's writing the foreword for my book, Glenn Vanderberg, and I said, can we just talk and brainstorm some ideas? And this is what we came up with, which was help your boss help you. But whenever I talk to somebody, when I give my elevator pitch, it's always, this is how to manage your manager in order to get what you want in your job and in your career.
Right. Cool. It's very Jerry Maguire type title, though.
Well, I wish I'd been able to come up with something. I don't know. Nobody I know who knew the other title likes this one. You know what I mean? But it's a funny thing.
No. I like the title, even though I can't remember it. I do like it.
Well, wait a second.
She's your editor, so don't worry about it.
Well, I've watched this happen.
I'm not an editor, no.
Oh, okay.
No, you were the original one, but then we switched to Susan because I knew Susan. And the funny part is I can actually watch it happen. When I tell the title to somebody who knew the other one, you see the disappointment in their eyes. They're like, oh, I really like the other title better. And it takes them about 5 or 6 minutes for them to talk themselves into the new title. You could actually, or I actually have watched it happen over and over again where they go, you know what, that actually makes sense because you really are trying to find ways to get your manager to help you and it works. And you know, after 10 minutes, they're like, yeah, okay, that'll do. I mean, I still like the other one, but that's fine. And it took me months, of course, because I'd called this thing Managing Your Manager for years. But I'm actually okay with the title now, too. But you can almost watch it physically happen in people's eyes.
Well, it's also survival in corporate world is helping your manager, you know?
Again, you can justify it or rationalize it however you like, as long as you get there, I guess. At this point, it is what it is. You know, this is going to be the title. And as I say, I've kind of gotten used to it. It doesn't really bother me anymore. And if you think about it, it is pretty descriptive. But internally, inside my head, I still default to Managing Your Manager. So don't worry, Tammy, that didn't bother me at all.
I know it's sort of like my default setting, but I have to say, you know, title aside, your book, I wish I had your book years ago when I was, you know, full on into the workforce and having to deal with managers. I mean, you know, as a private consultant and whatnot, I may not have to deal with managers directly, but I do have to deal with clients and things of that nature. And the stuff that you talk about in your book, I mean, it's also relevant. It doesn't matter if somebody else's name is on a paycheck or something like that. The advice that you give and the strategies that you present in your book, I think it transcends just a manager-employee relationship. I do think that you can take that information and apply it to other areas of your life. And I really appreciate that you've taken the time to sit down and organize your thoughts and share it with the readers. And look, dude, I love your book, whatever it's called.
Well, you're very kind, and I really do appreciate that. This has been a tough challenge because in all my previous books, they were technical. I had a spec, you know, I had a compiler. I could write code and I could write tests and see if I was right. Whereas this stuff was all just my experiences over the years, and are you going to include something like this or like that? It was all up to me. And therefore, it felt like operating without a net. It really was very different. But I've been giving the presentation every couple of months for years. And so much of it has always been so well received that, of course, that was my beta test. That was my ability to, see whether people responded to it and what they liked. Should I be giving any comments a little bit more specific? Because, the people are wondering, what the heck is in this thing anyway? Should I give
Yeah, maybe some examples would be good.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So,
because I was going to say, this is like your 10,000 hours of practice before you got to writing.
That's not a bad way to think about it now that you bring it up. That's really good.
That's Malcolm Gladwell, by the way.
I'm going to reuse that. By the way, just as an aside, Prags, of course, have a group on Medium, and they publish, the company publishes under Pragmatic Programmers on Medium a bunch of articles. And I've been working with Margaret Eldridge and putting articles from the book on Medium. And there's like 3 or 4 out as of the time we're recording this. And I'm trying to maintain like one new one every week or every other week. So cool. There, a lot of evidence, a lot of background will be there. Also, of course, I've got my own newsletter, that Tales from the Jar Side, that I used to talk about.
Okay, I loved your newsletter, by the way. Can I don't mean to interrupt, because it's so rude of the host to interrupt the guest, but I look forward to your newsletter, and I don't really look forward to anybody's newsletter. Yours comes in no, it's true, man. Yours comes in, I'm like, I don't really have time for this, but wait, pen, click, boom, I'm reading it. I'm sorry. It's just the truth.
I'm never going to object to somebody interrupting to say something nice about that stuff. That's wonderful. I'm glad to hear that. I really have a lot of fun with it. But to get back to the specifics, to make the point here, there are certain lessons that I push in the book. Now, to tie into the one we were talking about with the hiring and everything, I say because management is so hard to measure, and it's so difficult to know whether you're dealing with good managers or not, that managers on their side tend to value loyalty very highly. And therefore, it's important to build a loyalty relationship with your manager that gives them what they need, but still allows you to stand up and object when they do things you don't like. And it's like, the point is, you do not achieve a constructive loyalty relationship by simply doing whatever your manager tells you to do. I'm a high maintenance employee. I couldn't do that anyway. And it doesn't work, because if you don't push back, they have no incentive to modify their behavior other than just telling you what to do and just assuming you'll do it. So the key is to be able to push back. And in order to find a comfortable way to push back, I looked at stuff I'd read about before involving the iterated prisoner's dilemma problem, the one from game theory, probably the most famous game theory problem of all. Prisoner's dilemma shows up in a wide range of topics, from economics to political science to just all over the place, everywhere. And I tried to apply it to the employee-manager relationship to talk about how you can push back in a way that preserves the loyalty relationship and still makes you feel comfortable and that you're standing up for yourself and you're getting what you need, where the real goal is to be heard. The goal is that your manager understands that you weren't happy about something, but it's not a crisis. You're going to go back to work, and that next time something comes up, they will keep your needs and desires in mind when making a decision. Now, of course, sometimes they won't, and I talk about that too, managers who refuse to learn. Another topic that's in there is about the whole concept of what's called good enough answers. The idea of saying, when you get a question from your boss, some open-ended, wild question, then of course in school you're trained that when a teacher asks you a question, they have an answer in mind. And not only do they have an answer in mind, they have a specific way they want to hear it. I call that the game of school. And in the business world, it's not like that at all. When someone asks you a question, it's because they're stuck and they can't make any progress. And the concept is that a good enough answer today is way, way better than a great answer next week. And I give a little bit of a template on how to put together in like 20 minutes or less a good enough answer that winds up making you look responsive and gives the manager the information they want and gives them a rough cost estimate of what it would take to get a better answer, and then leaves the decision as to whether to spend more time on this or not up to them, so that you don't put real work on hold while you're trying to figure out something there's no way you'd know, but you also don't ignore it either. You get a quick answer in there. And people will love responsiveness. I swear, I try to respond to emails and other requests within a couple hours at most on anything. And this has gotten me more work than any other single mechanism, because even if I'm not necessarily the most qualified, everybody loves it if they know you'll answer them when they have a question. So that sort of thing's in there. I'm trying to think what else would be in there. So the prisoner's dilemma stuff, the good enough answers.
So can you explain to me what the prisoner's dilemma is?
Oh, yeah, sure. Here's the idea. In the classic prisoner's dilemma, two prisoners are captured for the same crime and they're interrogated separately. And they can't communicate with each other. And each prisoner has to decide whether to cooperate with the other, which means don't say anything, or defect and turn in the opposite person. If they both cooperate with each other, they each serve a year. I mean, there's enough evidence there's going to be a penalty. If one defects and the other cooperates, the defector goes free and the cooperator serves 3 years. And if they both defect, if they both tell on each other, they each serve 2 years. Now, if you're only going to play this game once, if you're only going to be A or B and do it one time, then you defect, because you can see that defecting minimizes your losses no matter what the other person does. But when you change this to what they call the iterated prisoner's dilemma, when you play it over and over and over again, several hundred or thousand times, like a professor named Robert Axelrod did as a computer tournament, he had people submit programs to try to come up with strategies to maximize their output on an iterated prisoner's dilemma game. And when you look at this, there's a particular strategy which consisted of 4 lines of basic code, basically. And it was called tit for tat, was the name of the strategy. And the idea is that you start off by cooperating on the first move, and then on every subsequent move, you just echo what your opponent did on the previous move. You just do what they did. So if they defected, you defect. If they cooperated, you cooperate. If they then change the next one, you change again. And it's a very easily diagnosable strategy. And Axelrod has many examples of this coming up in the real world, like the Christmas truce in World War I. And, there's a whole bunch of things in there. So what I tried to do was to take that and apply it to the employee-manager relationship. Because one of the concepts here, by the way, is that it's a non-zero-sum game. In other words, it's possible for both sides to win. It's not I have to beat you, because if you're doing that with your manager, you've already lost. That's going to be bad. So the concept applied to the employee-manager relationship is to say you start off by cooperating, and then when they do something you don't like, the defection takes the role of what I call just push back. You go in their office, you shut the door, whatever that means, just something private, so it doesn't threaten a loyalty relationship. You say, look, I'm not happy, and you talk about it, and you express what you want and why you're not happy. And sometimes the manager will accommodate you and sometimes they won't. But either way, you then go back to work, because you're communicating several things. You're communicating first that you're not happy, and that's worth communicating. You're standing up for yourself, and that can be very validating. You're also making it clear this is a problem, but not a crisis. This isn't like, if you don't beat what I want, I'm out of here. Because here's the problem. Most employees in a conflict with their manager think they only have 2 choices. They can either go along with what the manager said, which is probably what the company wants them to do, or they can leave. And those are both extremes. And this whole idea of doing the tit-for-tat strategy with your manager is an intermediate thing to try that builds up experience. And the manager starts to learn, hopefully, that anytime they do something you won't like, they're going to hear about it. You're going to make it clear that you're not happy about this. And most managers are human beings, despite evidence to the contrary. They don't really want conflict either. And therefore, they will hopefully over time learn to accommodate you. And also, they'll learn what you care about. Because a lot of managers will say, I had no idea that was so important to you. Well, you're making it clear in a way that does not threaten the overall loyalty relationship that, look, you did something I didn't like. I was passed over for a promotion, or I wasn't given the task, the project I wanted to be on, or even as simple as you didn't give me the money to upgrade my IDE or something like that. Could be anything. Right. And you make it clear that you can disagree without being disagreeable and without causing a crisis. And of course, the best part is some managers eventually do learn. Now we talk about.
I am a manager. I should have told you at the beginning of this I'm a manager, right? But
yeah, well, now some managers don't, by the way, and
yeah, no, I know, but I have managers too, so I have to. I'm curious about your book for my benefit too, right?
Well, I know that you can get a copy if you like.
Yes, I know. In fact, I know how to get one too.
Yeah. See, the thing is, though, is I've done this actually with some really high maintenance managers I've had. Obviously, I can't offer names.
I've had those too. Yeah.
Yeah. And I have always been surprised when they bend. When they go, okay, I understand better, but you're giving them a face-saving exit. You're not threatening them publicly. You're not making it like, if you don't bend, this is all over. You're not trashing them on social media, Instead, You are privately making the point that, look, I get it. Maybe you can help me. Maybe you can't. Maybe you had to do it. Maybe you didn't. But, I didn't like it. And then next time I'm going to say it again. And next time I'm going to say it again. And eventually they start to accommodate. Or if they don't, the other benefit to this is you've built up a series of events so that when you go to HR for your exit interview and they said, did you tell your boss you weren't happy? And I'd say, yeah, I told him this time and this time and this time. And, you never want the fact that you're leaving to be a surprise to your manager, because then both sides missed any chance to make it better.
Cool. All right. So I don't know if you've heard the show before, but we do have a series we're calling the Hot Seat Questions.
Right. No, I listened to several. I like this podcast. I listen to it a lot.
Oh, do you?
Okay.
Oh, yeah. I kind of like it too. Anyway, all right. So if you're ready and you're seated comfortably, we can put you in the hot seat and ask you some questions. All right. So who or what was influential in your career?
That's a hard question for me because I can't pin it down to a single individual or a single moment. I will say that one of the groups that made life much easier for me when I did move into a new technical area was the Groovy programming language community. People like Guillaume Laforge as the head of the Groovy programming language. Paul King is another key member there. Graham Roche, Andre Salmire, a whole bunch of them were about the nicest group of geniuses I ever met. They were just phenomenal. And when I would write a blog post to try something out in Groovy, they would wander by and say, hey, interesting. And by the way, you could cut your code in half if you did this, and then I would learn. And they welcomed me at conferences. I now host the Groovy Podcast, or co-host rather, the Groovy Podcast as well. And it's just been a wonderful, wonderful community for me to be involved with. And I just have to give them all the credit in the world. It's just unfortunate that the language hasn't become more dominant than it has. And there's various reasons for that. But nevertheless, that would be my answer, I think.
Cool. All right. Well, I was going to say, well, what do you like most about your favorite programming language? But I think you might have answered.
Although I got to say, I have a book now on Java, and I really like the changes that have been made to Java since Java 8. I teach a training class on what's new in Java, and I go all the way up through 17. And I really am pleased with most of the changes that have been made to the language. And then I dug into the Kotlin area because I was teaching Android, and now you have to be a Kotlin person if you're going to work with Android. And Gradle also, in addition to having a Groovy DSL, has a Kotlin DSL as well. So I like Kotlin, I like Java, but Groovy's always going to be my first love.
Cool. Can we take a sidebar here and discuss Gradle for a minute?
Sure.
Because I work in a corporate environment. We build iOS and Android apps at the same time, and we've taken the Gradle out of our iOS builds. But for the neophytes out there, Gradle is that what is used to build Java apps?
Yeah, Gradle is an excellent build tool. It's a direct rival to Maven, of course, and Maven's got more mind share, if you will, in the marketplace, which I know is a bit of some frustration to the people that behind Gradle, the Gradle Incorporated. In fact, I teach the intro Gradle class for Gradle Incorporated every other month, that sort of. And because it's a DSL, it allows you to much more simply and easily express the sorts of automated things you want to do. Pile the code, build an executable, run all your tests, then build an executable, then even deploy it. And one of the hot areas in Kotlin these days, although I haven't spent much time in it, is the sort of multi-module build, the multi-mobile build, the ones where you could build an app both for Android and iOS. And a lot of that's done with Gradle plugins as well.
Oh, nice. Okay, cool. So what is your favorite text editor or IDE and why?
I'm very much an IntelliJ person. I was an Eclipse person back in the early 2000s when it was shiny and new, and I really liked the fact that I could get so much power for free. But when Android adopted Android Studio, that was finally, which by the way, Android Studio is based on IntelliJ's core.
Right.
So that was what finally pushed me to go ahead and get the license. And I'm even now a partner with JetBrains for Kotlin. And I really, the more time I spend with it, the more I use it. In fact, I used the Markdown editor inside of IntelliJ to write my Prag book.
Cool. All right. So, and if you could choose another profession, what would it be?
Well, see, that's the thing. I've thought about that. And the truth is, it took me almost 40 years to find my dream job, and I have it now. I mean, I really, I was miserable for so long, and I was looking to say, is there anything else I can do that would be successful and whatever? And like I said, I looked at writing fiction. I looked at all kinds of stuff. And the truth is that right now I'm doing exactly what I love, and I get to expand it and write books and blogs and newsletters and make presentations and all this stuff. Really, my goal now is to be able to continue to do it.
Okay, cool. This question sounds a little bit flat for you, I think, but would you prefer to work alone or with a team?
I'm pretty much working on my own. I mean, now that's partly one of the challenges with teaching, especially teaching training classes, is it is a pretty isolated profession. You don't run into that many other trainers, if you will. And the students, of course, I have students around, but that's a very different relationship. So part of the reason I like the conference tours is because it gives me a community of people to hang out with, to be friendly with. But when I'm doing work, when I'm coming up with new talks or I'm teaching classes or whatever, I'm pretty much always working alone. The communal part, the cooperative part comes when I'm learning topics and asking questions and making connections in the community to help me do my job.
All right. Now, these are this or that section. Would you prefer ebook or a book?
I'm very much an ebook person. I'm almost exclusively an ebook person at this point. I like that it remembers where I left off. I like that it's backlit so that I don't have to worry about lighting wherever I am. I like that I can make the font size bigger as I get older, you know. It's really useful for me. And I like that that the books don't take up that much room in my house and I can travel with them. So I really am very much an ebook person.
Form or function?
I thought about this and I have to go with function. I used to think that form was really important, and I'm sure it is. It's just that, like, when you look at Macs, okay, you look at a MacBook Pro, and the way the MacBook Pro evolved under Tim Cook, that's an example of what can go wrong when all they care about is form. I mean, that right. Awful, touch bar that I've hated from the beginning is an example of something that looked cool that I have just loathed from the start, and I just can't wait to get a new Mac that doesn't have it anymore. Okay,
so pen or pencil?
Oh, when I was in engineering, I used mechanical pencils all the time. I really liked those constantly because I had to do a lot of erasing and a lot of note-taking and stuff like that. But now I'm almost exclusively pen because it lasts, but of course, I don't really use either. I mostly open up a Google Doc and just take notes,
Yeah, I'm the same way. I use OneNote or Notes or whatever.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and I regret it when I write stuff with my pen because I can't read what I just wrote.
Exactly. That's the other problem. It's got my handwriting's gotten worse.
Well, I think we spend more time on the keyboards. We forget how to write. Not that we were ever really good at it. The last question, Star Wars or Star Trek?
Oh, well, that's easy. Babylon 5.
Bill Mooney to the end.
The last best hope for peace, of course, which failed. But I love Babylon 5, and the whole series is on HBO Max, and we've watched it, my wife and I, any number of times. I still love it. The individual episodes are up and down, but the overall arc, the 5-year arc that Straczynski put together, it was wonderful. I followed it in the 90s when Straczynski was interacting on Usenet with rec.arts.sf.tv.babylon5, I've even met the guy at a conference at a convention once, and he was charming. It's definitely Babylon 5. And then, of course, after that, I know that you have some interest in Firefly as well, of course.
Yeah, Tammy's a huge fan.
Wait. What? Ken, how do you even know about that? Because I was just about to pick on Tim for saying that I'll probably go watch Babylon 5 next week because I'm looking for a new series, but I was afraid that Tim was going to be mad because it took me, 6 years to watch Firefly?
Well, the problem with Firefly, first of all, I delayed watching it because I knew it was canceled and I didn't want to be heartbroken. You know what I mean? But eventually I watched it and I really liked it, and I liked Serenity. Of course, I'm reevaluating everything by Joss Whedon based on what we've learned about him since then.
Yes.
But still, and of course, nowadays, The Expanse is phenomenal. You know, I really enjoy The Expanse. But if I really do answer your direct question, I'm much more of a Star Trek person than I am a Star Wars person, especially since Jar Jar Abrams got a hold of it and just destroyed everything.
Jar Jar.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I used to make lots of Star Trek analogies in my training classes, and the problem is that nobody, you know, the students have aged out of the original series, and then I would make next-gen references, and sometimes they get those and sometimes they don't. So now and I've watched all the new series, and I love Lower Decks. I think Lower Decks is a riot.
Yeah, it's hilarious.
That's my favorite, yeah. So
I do too, yeah.
Yeah, whereas Star Wars stuff, I really became disenchanted pretty early. And, you know, they've only had like 2 good movies out of 9. And the last ones, there was 2 disasters out of the last 3 anyway. And, you know, so at any rate, it's very much Star Trek over Star Wars for me. But really, it's Babylon 5.
Such geeks.
I knew it. I knew you were a Star Trek guy because you have values and sensibility.
Values.
I don't know where to go with that.
I don't know where to go with that either. Yeah.
I know where I'm going to go with that. Lots of hate mail. That's where I'm going to go with that.
Oh, I'll back you up. It's okay.
So I think you're old enough to. You sound like you're in the same age range as me, because I think you're old enough to remember when sci-fi movies were horrible.
Oh yeah,
like before A New Hope, right?
Right.
I mean, you know, 2001: Space Odyssey was like the best movie ever, based on compared to any other sci-fi.
It took it all seriously.
Maybe Planet, or Planet of the Apes was another good one too.
Right.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, because we had Lost in Space, and we had like Lost in Space was the Brady Bunch in a tin can, you know, like, and Brady Bunch was an improvement.
Exactly. And when I was 7, I'm like, Dr. Smith needs to be shown to the airlock. Episode 2, you know?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't know. Do you remember watching Star Trek when it was first on, or at least
what I really remember was the first generation of reruns. So I mean, it was on when I was a kid. And I watched it, but didn't really take. But when we hit the early 70s and it started to really do reruns all the time, that's when, like, my sister and I could quote practically the entire Trouble with Tribbles episode back and forth. You know?
Oh, my favorite episode right there, man. That is my favorite episode.
Yeah. Or like I watched the animated. I used to watch Saturday morning cartoons and see the animated Star Trek. I mean, I remember
even
that.
At the time, I was like, this is all kind of okay. You know, it's like there were some good episodes, but mostly it wasn't. Now, of course, all the episodes are available on every series on, I think it's Paramount Plus now. And periodically we'll go back and watch the Best of Both Worlds and some of the others. And by the way, I did a Best of Both Worlds analogy in the book because I was able to tie it to the idea of bypassing the chain of command. So that idea. Cool.
So later on tonight, in like a couple of hours, I'm actually recording my other podcast, which is called Spotcast, which strangely enough is about Star Trek. Anyway.
Excellent. That's great. I love to hear that.
All right, Ken, Kousen, thanks for being on our show. And if you could do us a favor and let our listeners know what you're doing, what you're working on next, and how they get in touch with you.
Well, the easiest way to reach me is you have my email address, and also that newsletter that Tammy mentioned called Tales from the Jar Side is on Substack. So that's an easy way to find out. My email address and other contact information is in the Medium posts as well. I'm actually fairly visible online, and since my last name is spelled so unusually, it's not that hard to Google for me as well. I'm not, right now that this book is finishing, I'm doing all sorts of things to support the marketing, like writing those Medium posts and maybe recording some videos and just things related to that. I don't know what's going to happen book-wise next, except that since I've just gone book to book to book, I think it's time for a little bit of a break. We'll see.
Sounds reasonable. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Pragmatic Hero's Journey. You can find us on the web at pragprog.com. We're also on Twitter and Facebook as @pragprog. If you enjoy the podcast, please consider writing a review on iTunes and sharing a link on social media. Go ahead. Let the world know we're out there. And you can send us your feedback and guest requests to pragtalk@pragprog.com. And finally, if you're listening to the show and you'd like to know how you can help, please visit our website at pragprog.com for details.
And one last thing, Mr. Ken, I want you to know that you are officially our last guest of the season.
Oh, wow. Woo-hoo. What an honor. Thank you so much.
I know. we did it, man. We saved the best for last. So there you go.
Now, that's not nice to some of the people, but
oh gosh, this
don't
is
listen to
why
this show.
I get
Don't worry
hate
about
mail. This is what happens. This is why I get hate mail. I don't try to be a jerk. It just happens.
well, as we say on the Groovy Podcast, it's all right. Nobody's listening anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Pretty much.
I love it. I love it. Well, Ken, thank you so much for being part of this show. I really, really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much. I got to say, this book really matters to me. This is something that's very different from some of the others. And I really want to do everything I can to help people with this. So please let me know I could help. And I'm looking forward to it coming out, and we'll talk soon.
All right. Fantastic.
Cool.
Tim, I'm going to hang up before my computer blows up. And
All right.
I'll talk to y'all later.
Yeah, great to meet you, Ken.
Take care. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Pragmatic Hero's Journey. We hope you enjoyed the show. For more information about the Pragmatic Hero's Journey, please visit pragprog.com or send an email to pragtalk@pragprog.com.